This is day 3 of the annual meeting. Thank you for being here bright and early. And this is one of my favorite things. So every other year, the ALI awards the Early Career Scholars Medal to one or two outstanding early career law professors whose work is relevant to public policy and has the potential to influence improvements in the law. Winning this award is a very big deal and a very hard thing to do. The deans of over 80 schools nominated one outstanding scholar. A committee of 12 distinguished ALI members worked really hard to select 2 extraordinary scholars as the winners of the medal, and they do this every other year. The group that picked our current winner was chaired by Justice Mariano Florentino Cuellar, then of the California Supreme Court, and now the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The committee was unanimous in its admiration of the work of David Pozen and enthusiastically awarded him the Early Career Scholar Medal. This actually happened back in 2019, but we had a pandemic, and that's why the presentation didn't happen until now. It would have been less meaningful on Zoom. David, despite having been considered early in his career only 3 years ago, is now the Vice Dean for Intellectual Life and the Charles Keller Beekman Professor of Law at Columbia. He's a summa cum laude graduate of Yale, got a Master of Science degree from Oxford, and a law degree from Yale, where he won a truly astonishing number of awards. I didn't actually know they had this many awards, much less that David would actually win them all. He was then a law clerk to Judge Merrick Garland and to Justice John Paul Stevens. After serving for 2 years as a special advisor to our council member Harold Koh, then the legal advisor at the State Department, he joined the Columbia faculty in 2012. David writes in the areas of constitutional law, information law, and nonprofit law. Justice Cuellar described David's writings on government secrecy and constitutional theory as remarkable and widely influential, as timely as they are learned, and as creative and thought-provoking as they are nuanced and precise. I wholeheartedly agree with that assessment, and it was actually a great pleasure for me. David was a visiting professor at NYU Law School before the pandemic, and we got to spend a lot of time together, and I was extraordinarily impressed by the breadth of his intellectual interests and accomplishments. Today, David will give a talk on computational analysis of constitutional polarization, which is work he co-authored with Eric Talley and Julian Nyarko. David, it's an honor to present you with the Early Career Scholars Medal. I'm not sure there actually is a medal to present you with, but I'm delighted that you're here as a winner of our award.
Thank you so much, Ricky, for that generous introduction. I also want to thank Stephanie Middleton and Judy Cole for putting this presentation together, and all of you for waking up early in the last day of the meeting. As Ricky said, I teach at Columbia. My main area is constitutional law and politics, and also write about transparency and some related issues. Methodologically, I consider myself a pluralist, using different methods depending on the problem being approached, which sometimes means teaming up with co-authors who have different skill sets than I do to be able to address an issue. And this paper I'm going to present today is very much in that mold. I am not a data scientist or a computational expert of any kind. My co-authors were, and it allowed us to get traction, I hope, on this issue of polarization. So I'm not sure who's controlling the slides, but if we could, thank you very much. Okay, so of all the projects I've worked on recently, it was suggested to me that this study of constitutional polarization might be of greatest interest this morning, both because groups like ALI inevitably struggle to overcome or manage polarization, and because it has fancy slides. So the project, in a nutshell, looks at constitutional discourse in Congress. So the focus is not on the courts, but rather on the legislative branch and how members of Congress speak about the Constitution there. The basic idea is that we got all of the floor remarks made in Congress from 1873 to the Trump presidency. Then we trained a machine learning classifier, actually several, to try to predict, based solely on the semantic content of the utterances, who is speaking. Is it a Democrat or a Republican? Or is it a liberal or a conservative? And the idea is that the easier the machine classifier finds it to guess who is speaking based solely on the words, the more polarization there is across the groups in question, because there must be something systematically distinctive about the way those two groups are talking if the machine finds it very easy to guess who is talking just based on what's said. And in addition, we wanted to look at how does that kind of discursive polarization vary when members of Congress are talking about the Constitution versus making ordinary non-constitutional political remarks. Do we see a discrepancy there? Okay, so I need to, given that our time constraints, I need to zoom through this slide deck, but hopefully can present the main results. At least we're not on Zoom. So why did we approach this problem at all? The basic idea is there's tremendous interest, as you know, in polarization in Congress, in its potential asymmetric quality, what might be driving it. And there are a lot of reasons to suspect that there's also constitutional polarization across the main political parties and other groups. But the literature to date addressing anything we might describe as constitutional polarization has largely been qualitative and somewhat speculative. So we wanted to know whether we could bring an empirical perspective to study this potential phenomenon. As the last bullet point notes, there's also a kind of interesting theoretical ambiguity about what we should find when we look at the polarization of how people talk about the Constitution in Congress versus other subjects. There are some constitutional scholars and many political pundits who like to talk about the Constitution as a kind of ideational or symbolic glue for the country. You know, it helps us overcome our partisan divides, temper partisan passions, and bring us together. A scholar such as Reva Siegel might be exemplary in this vein. On the other hand, there are constitutional scholars increasingly writing that perhaps it's quite the opposite, that when we talk about the Constitution, it fosters corrosive winner-takes-all dynamics and leads to pathological and more polarized discourse. Someone like Jamal Green might be exemplary in that regard. And finally, there are scholars like Fred Schauer who have said, really, constitutional argument is just an epiphenomenon of political argument. It's just another species of political argument. If that's right, then we should expect constitutional and non-constitutional polarization to travel together. So which is it? The data set, this just captures how we're looking across different dimensions, constitutional versus non-constitutional speech, liberals and conservatives, which will break out from Democrat and Republican at one point coming up, and across time periods. This is the data set. We can't claim credit for creating it. There were researchers at Stanford who got a big NSF grant to put it together. It is enormous. Every single thing said by a member of Congress since 1873, as I mentioned, so big we had to actually reserve time on the Central Columbia University mainframe to run some of our queries overnight. I'll skip through the details. Okay, the first threshold issue that confronts a project trying to isolate and then study constitutional discourse on the floor of Congress is what counts as a constitutional remark versus a non-constitutional remark. There is no off-the-shelf solution to that question. And the simplest way to think about it might be just, is the C word used? You know, does the word constitution or a variant of it, constitutional, unconstitutional, appear in the remark? And that is our kind of baseline, simplest way of thinking about when the Constitution has come up in someone's remarks. But of course, that is under-inclusive. There are lots of ways you could talk about the Constitution without using the C word, including naming clauses or phrases like advice and consent or separation of powers, some of which appear in the text of the document, some of which don't. Rather than use supervised learning, where we have a bunch of students try to figure out what's constitutional or not, we wanted a more objective method of distinguishing constitutional from non-constitutional remarks that could go way back in time. So we created a nested series of dictionaries to get at this issue. I'll show the dictionaries in a moment, layering on more and more terms associated with the Constitution to make sure we're capturing everything, and then running our main queries on the different dictionaries as a kind of robustness check. That last equation at the bottom, I'll just note, you could also think about constitutional remarks in one of two basic ways. One is as a binary. Does this speech that this member of Congress made mention the Constitution at all, or one of the terms in the Constitutional Dictionary at all? If yes, it's a constitutional speech. If no, not a constitutional speech. That's the binary method. But you can also do it in a more granular fashion, where you ask, how often does the Constitution or a constitutional term come up in the speech relative to the overall length of the speech? And if it's over some threshold, then we're going to call that a constitutional speech, ensuring that there's some focused attention and not just a stray remark. And we use that measure as well. Here are the dictionaries very briefly. Again, they get more elaborate as you go on, just to make sure both that we're not missing constitutional remarks that don't use the C word, and that we can run more interesting and kind of informative tests after we show the main results about what sorts of terms are most differentially used across the parties in Congress. So this I'll skip over and just this go here. This is showing how many remarks in Congress are constitutional over time, using different tests for what counts as a constitutional remark. The share is never all that high as far as a sheer percentage of floor remarks, but there are some interesting results right away here before we even get to our analyses. For one thing, we see a real spike in the post-war, particularly the 1960s era, which further inquiry suggests is tied to all the debates that were happening around civil rights legislation at the time. You also see that under the simplest test of does any constitutional term come up at all, we see a kind of secular trend toward a higher share of floor remarks are mentioning the Constitution these days than in the past. However, if you jump down to the bottom purple line that looks at remarks that have a reasonable density of constitutional discourse within them, that is not just stray references, but some more focused attention to the Constitution, that share is actually, if anything, declining over time. In other words, in a nutshell, members of Congress are more likely to invoke the Constitution in any given floor speech today, but also to do so more superficially than in the past. Okay, so now we get to the main action. Actually, that's just a restatement of our basic way to think about and measure polarization. Here's the first set of results. So what do we find here? Basically, the three different graphs represent three different tests for algorithmic accuracy, three different classifiers that are trying to figure out who's speaking, again, based solely on the semantic content of the remarks. And the results are consistent across the classifiers, and they show that the machine finds it easier and easier over time to guess who's speaking based on the remarks. Moreover, when the Constitution, the yellowish line, is being discussed in the full remarks, it is just as easy, and indeed on most measures easier, to guess who's speaking. In other words, the discourse is more polarized than when the Constitution is not invoked. And across constitutional and non-constitutional remarks, there's been a major spike since the 1970s. We are more polarized rhetorically, as well as in voting behaviors and other things we political scientists like to measure. Okay, this raises a question, though. This is a question about the parties. Can the classifier guess whether a Democrat or a Republican is speaking based just on the words of what's being said? Now, it might be that liberals and conservatives have always spoken in recognizably distinct ways about the Constitution or otherwise. And all that's happened is that liberals have sorted over time into the Democratic camp, and conservatives have sorted into the Republican camp. And so there's been that alignment or purification of the parties, and that's what's driving this result. To try to figure out whether that's really what's driving this result, or rather instead, conservatives and liberals have become increasingly different in the way they talk about the Constitution. We used an alternative measure, not can you guess which party is speaking, a Democrat or Republican, but using Poole-Rosenthal scores, the standard political science measure for arraying on a left-right spectrum the voting behaviors of a member of Congress. We said anyone to the left of the median member of their Congress will call a liberal, anyone to the right will call a conservative, and we'll ask the classifiers to do the same thing. Can you guess whether a liberal is speaking or a conservative speaking? And they can. The results largely track what we found for parties, suggesting it's not just that liberals are now Democrats and conservatives are now Republicans that leads to the polarization results we find. Liberals and conservatives are speaking increasingly differently in general and particularly about the Constitution. We did a lot of robustness checks on this result. For example, you might think that constitutional remarks will tend to be longer on the floor of Congress because they're more serious or they have a more elaborate argument to make. And that may be skewing the results because classifiers find it easier to guess who's speaking the more they have to work with. You would be right that remarks are longer when the Constitution is invoked, but even controlling for length, we still see the same basic set of findings. So it's not just an artifact of that. And I won't get into any of this in detail, but using different dictionaries, using different measures of what counts as a constitutional remark, we see the same basic pattern. This explosive growth in polarization since the 1970s, roughly, as well as more growth on the constitutional side than on the non-constitutional side. And then this is much too elaborate to get into here, but there are other ways to think about the so-called disjointness of two groups' rhetoric in terms of the terms that they are more or less likely to use across our dictionaries. On these measures, too, we have an amazing spike in the discrepancy of rhetoric in the recent period, to the point that there has never, since the beginning of our data set in 1873, been more polarized discourse in Congress when the Constitution comes up. Okay, you may be wondering here, I'll skip this. This suggests that most of the action, the movement since the 1970s has been on the conservative side as far as who's coming to have a more distinctive constitutional rhetoric, which tends to support the asymmetric polarization thesis that Republicans have moved further to the right than Democrats to the left in recent years. Okay, this slide suggests when your party is out of power, either in terms of not controlling the legislative chamber of which you're a member or not controlling the presidency, do you become more or less likely to invoke the Constitution? Is the Constitution used by those in power to consolidate authority and defend what they want to do, or is it used by those out of power as a kind of weapon of the weak to attack the moves being made by the party in power? And the basic answer is it's more the latter. It's not a huge finding or a huge effect, but there is a differential proclivity to invoke the Constitution when you're out of power more than when you're in it. Okay, and then here we get into what is happening. So we've shown that machines find it easier to guess who's talking, a Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, but why? And I as a non-data scientist, had a very naive question, it turns out, to my co-authors when we first found our striking headline results. I said, this is amazing. Let's ask the algorithms, ask the classifiers, why Democrats and Republicans now speak so differently? Just what is it about their speech that's so distinctive? Why does the classifier find it easier over time? And my co-authors basically laughed at me and said, that's not how it works. It's an atheoretical thing we're doing here. It learns as it goes. You cannot ask the classifier to back out of it the theory by which it got better at predicting or found it easier to predict who was speaking. So you actually have to do different sorts of tests to try to figure that out. The classifier will not tell you why it finds it easier to guess who's talking, given the nature of the way it works. But if we just look at the most distinctive terms in a given period, we can start to make some headway on that question. So this, the verb owns is used casually there, of course. What we're looking at here is in the time period in question, what are the most distinctive terms from our expansive constitutional dictionary, with distinctiveness being measured as the relative difference in one party or the other being more likely to use the term. So the more one party dominates usage of a term, the more distinctive it is. And then we ask what are the most distinctive, regardless of party, in the period. And I submit that these findings are truly striking. In the 1959 to 1976 period, Democrats owned constitutional discourse in Congress. They were far more robust users of the expanded constitutional dictionary, largely in the effort to push civil rights and voting rights legislation that they were engaged in at the time. Flash forward to the most recent period in our data set, and the story has basically flipped. With the exception of a few terms associated with the Reconstruction amendments, like civil rights and voting rights, Republicans now dominate constitutional discourse in Congress, and there's been an inversion. There's also an interesting phenomenon captured by this slide and in other slides that I won't have time to present about the parts of the Constitution that the two different political parties are more or less likely to invoke. And in a nutshell, the Republicans seem to be the party, at least discursively, of the Founders' Constitution, much more likely to invoke terms associated with the original document dating to 1789, whether we're talking about terms from that text or invocations of the Founding Fathers themselves, or phrases like originalism, interpretive methods associated with the founding. The Democrats, in contrast, seem to be the party of the Reconstruction amendments. The 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments are about the only part of the Constitution that Democrats still invoke more than Republicans, and Republicans basically never say civil rights, voting rights in the period in question, or at least nowhere nearly as often as Democrats. There are constitutional scholars, I think of Kim Roosevelt, I think is an ALI member at University of Pennsylvania, who has written that the great tension in constitutional law and politics in this country is between the Founders' Constitution and the Reconstruction Constitution. We have almost a schizophrenic constitution. He says other countries would have rewritten their canonical document after a civil war. We pasted on top of the original text, a totally different text with totally different values, concerned about equality, to support national government power, and so forth. You could see Kim Roosevelt's story of two different constitutions packed into one reflected in results like this, I think. Moreover, it also suggests that both parties basically have constitutional scripts that they use. The subject matter may change depending on what they're discussing, but the same themes, tropes, and ideological fault lines recur across issue areas. And it's quite predictable at this point how they're going to invoke the Constitution. Okay, I need to, I think, start to wrap. So let me just say, in the Obama administration, you see utter Republican domination, again, of constitutional discourse, except with a little bit of blue on voting and civil rights. The House introduced C-SPAN on the floor in 1979 in committee meetings. The Senate actually came later in 1986. That's not a totally exogenous shock, but it affords an opportunity to test whether C-SPAN's introduction might have driven the uptick in discursive polarization that we see, with members becoming more performative, and we see a little bit of evidence in that, with the House polarizing in its constitutional rhetoric sooner after it gets C-SPAN, and the Senate following, but not entirely robust evidence that we can make a conclusive determination. And finally, I'll just say we see a similar thing, by the way, in editorials in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And since this is the lightning round, I'll just come to the end. Why should we care? Hopefully it's of intrinsic interest just to have a new way to think about polarization, study it, test it, and look at trends over time. Also, this isn't reflected on the slide, but the kind of data and methods that we use in this paper haven't really been used in legal scholarship before, and we think they provide lots of different ways to get at different sorts of questions, not just the constitutional and the partisan polarization on which we focus, but you could ask, how do members of Congress talk differently depending on age, sex, race, educational background? Do they have a law degree? You could look across all kinds of indicia and characteristics. In an election year, Do members of the Congress talk about the Constitution or other things differently? What about during a Supreme Court confirmation hearing? And then you can ask more discrete questions teed up by historical and qualitative scholarship. So a book that's been getting a lot of attention recently is by Joey Fishkin and Willie Forbath, in which they claim that there's been what they call a great forgetting of constitutional political economy. They claim that it used to be the case that when people talked about issues of economic equality and opportunity, they talked about them in a constitutional key. But we've lost touch with that tradition. Now we think those economic issues don't have anything to do with the Constitution, and they urge us to, bring it back. Are they right that there's been a great forgetting, that when people used to talk about issues of economic equality constitutionally? We could test that using these kinds of methods. That's the basic idea, but the final sobering note I'll end on is, if anyone wanted to find from this study that when we turn to the Constitution, we have a means of dampening polarization and transcending our partisan divides, our results, in fact, not only don't give you comfort, but should give you heartburn, because when the Constitution comes up, we find only more discrepancy, only more of a divide, and only a greater ease of guessing who's speaking just based on the nature of the remarks. So if this is a felicitous way to think about polarization, we have severe constitutional polarization, even more severe than ordinary political polarization. The Constitution is not going to get us out of the mess we're in, and we're going to have to think about other ways to move on as a country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for a truly great talk. And I hope you see why it's important for the ALI to run this early career scholars program. We've identified such talent, and David is a great exponent of that. So it was a great way to start the morning.